year was 1200 BCE, and the air on the Aegean Sea was a chaotic and violent storm that smelled of salt spray, rotting wood, and the iron scent of the blood spilled by the undead. Kratos stood on the deck of a massive wooden ship, the air around him thick with the mist and the spray of the black water. He was a man with skin as white as ash, a constant reminder of the family he had lost, and the air in his lungs was a heavy and rhythmic pulse of anger. He had been a servant of the gods of Olympus for 10 years, and the air of the sea was just another battlefield in his long search for a peace that never came. He gripped the chains of the blades of chaos, the metal clicking against his bracers, and the air around the blades smelled of sulfur and the heat of a forge. A massive creature known as the Hydra rose from the depths, its multiple heads tearing through the hulls of the nearby ships. The air was filled with the deafening and rhythmic roars of the beast and the wood snap of the breaking masts. Kratos moved across the slick decks, the air whistling as he swung his blades to clear the way of the skeletons that rose from the deck boards. He felt the spray of the cold sea on his face, but the air in his chest remained hot and dry. He climbed the rigging of the central ship, the air becoming thin and wild with the wind as he reached the highest point. Below him, the largest head of the Hydra snapped at the air, its breath a toxic and swampy fog that smelled of the deep ocean rot. The battle with the Hydra was a struggle of pure and raw strength. Kratos jumped from the mast, the air rushing past him as he drove his blades into the soft tissue of the monster neck. The air was a blur of movement and sound, and the rhythmic splashing of the waves punctuated every strike. He used the heavy chains to pin the smaller heads to the wooden planks, the air ringing with the sound of the metal against the timber. Finally, he faced the king head at the top of the main mast. The air was thick with the scent of the beast blood and the salt. Kratos pulled the creature jaw open and drove the jagged wood of a broken mast through its throat, and the air suddenly turned into a quiet and ringing silence as the monster died. Inside the belly of the beast, the air was stagnant and smelled of the fish and the dampness of the gut. Kratos found the ship captain hiding in the dark, the air around the man smelling of the sharp sweat of terror. Kratos took the key he needed and dropped the man into the abyss of the monster throat, the air carrying no mercy for the weak. He emerged back onto the deck as the storm began to break, the air turning a pale and shimmering gray. He looked out at the wreckage of the fleet, the air now carrying the faint and fresh scent of the morning. He had done what the gods asked, but the air in his mind was still full of the screams of his past. The ship sailed toward Athens, the air on the water becoming warm and carrying the scent of the dry earth and the wild thyme. Kratos sat in the cabin, the air there still and smelling of the old wine and the cedar wood. He saw a vision of the goddess Athena in the dancing flames of a candle, her voice a cool and steady vibration in the quiet. She told him that Ares, the god of war, was destroying her city, and that the air of Greece was being choked by his madness. If Kratos could stop the god, the air of his own life might finally be cleared of the nightmares. Kratos felt a flicker of hope, a feeling as fragile as the mountain mist, and prepared for the battle that waited on the shores. They reached the harbor of Piraeus as the sun began to set, the air turning a deep and bruised purple. The city of Athens was already burning, the air thick with the smoke and the iron scent of the coming slaughter. Kratos stepped onto the stone docks, the air vibrating with the distant and rhythmic thud of the catapults and the roar of the fire. He saw the shadow of Ares towering over the Acropolis, the air around the god, a physical force of hatred and destruction. Kratos took a deep breath, the air filling his lungs with the scent of the war he had been born to fight. He was the ghost of Sparta, and the hunt for a god was about to begin. The streets of the harbor were a maze of fire and shadow. The air was filled with the sound of the panicked citizens and the clatter of the bronze shields of the Athenian guards. Kratos moved through the ruins, the air whistling as his blades found the hearts of the minotaurs that Ares had summoned to the world. He felt the heat of the flames on his skin, the air smelling of the scorched stone and the heavy tallow of the lanterns. He reached a bridge where the air was cold and carried the scent of the damp sea wall. He fought a giant cyclops, the air ringing with the sound of his blades against the creature club. He moved with a brutal and focused speed, the air barely stirred as he neutralized the threat. As the fires grew higher, Kratos saw the citizens of Athens running for their lives, their air one of a desperate and sharp terror. He ignored their pleas, the air in his own heart having turned to stone years ago. He moved with the singular purpose of reaching the city gates, the air around him thick with the ash and the smell of the burning tapestries. He found a massive stone gate that had been barred from the inside, the air there still and smelling of the old dust. He used the strength of his arms to force the heavy bronze bolts, the sound of the metal snapping a rhythmic and sharp crack in the silence. The path into the heart of the city was open, and the air that rushed out was hot and smelled of the coming judgment. Kratos stood at the entrance to the main thoroughfare, the air there a chaotic roar of the wind and the fire. He saw the massive feet of Ares stepping through the buildings in the distance, each step a rhythmic and deafening thud that shook the city to its foundations. Kratos felt a cold and steady resolve. He checked the chains on his arms, the metal clicking in the silence of the gatehouse. He knew that the gods were watching him from their heights, their air one of a detached and cruel curiosity. He took a deep breath, the air filling his lungs with the smoke and the promise of a revenge that had been 10 years in the making. The first part of his journey ended as he stepped into the main square of Athens, the air there a deep and glowing orange. He was surrounded by the ruins of a civilization, but he only saw a path to his own redemption. The moon rose over the harbor, the air still and expectant as he prepared to find the oracle who could lead him to the power to kill a god. He looked at the blades in his hands, the metal reflecting the fires of the city, and moved forward into the dark. The air in the center of Athens was a thick and gritty blanket of gray smoke that smelled of burning cedar, scorched marble, and the sharp and metallic tang of the blood drying on the cobblestones. Kratos moved past the shattered merchant stalls, the atmosphere becoming heavier with the scent of the war that Ares had brought to the land. High above, the god of war moved through the skyline, his silhouette cutting through the orange haze of the fires. The air around the god was a physical force, vibrating with a low and rhythmic hum of power that made the stone buildings tremble as if the earth itself were afraid. Kratos ignored the trembling ground, his breath a steady and focused rhythm as he pushed through the narrow alleys where the air was stagnant and heavy with the smell of the dead. He reached a wide plaza where the air was filled with the sound of snapping wood and the rhythmic clanking of the bronze shields of the Athenian soldiers. The soldiers were being overwhelmed by the legionnaires of the undead, whose air was one of a cold and silent efficiency that smelled of the old dust and the damp earth. Kratos joined the fray, the air whistling as he swung the blades of chaos in wide and fiery arcs. Every strike filled the air with the scent of sulfur and the iron scent of the dark energy that held the skeletons together. He moved with a brutal and calculated speed, his white skin glowing in the firelight. The air in the square was a blur of movement and sound until the last of the monsters fell, leaving the area in a sudden and ringing silence. The path toward the city center led him to a graveyard on the edge of the residential district. The air here was cooler and smelled of the damp stone and the fresh and cold earth. In the middle of the fighting, Kratos found a mysterious old man digging a grave, the air around him smelling of the dry soil and the absolute stillness of a tomb. The man did not look up as Kratos approached, his shoveling a rhythmic and steady sound in the quiet of the cemetery. The gravedigger spoke of a destiny that Kratos could not escape. His voice, a low and raspy vibration in the still air, he told Kratos that the gods had a plan for him, but the air of the man's words was heavy with a secret that remained hidden in the shadows. Kratos left the old man to his work, the air in his chest feeling like a gathering storm. He entered a grand temple where the air was a sweet and heavy perfume of incense, dried lilies, and the beeswax of the candles that still burned in the dark corners. The atmosphere inside was still and carried the weight of 1,000 years of prayer. Kratos saw a statue of the goddess Athena, the air around the marble feeling cool and carrying a faint and electric ozone. Through the stone lips of the statue, the goddess spoke to him again. Her voice was a steady vibration in the quiet air, telling him that he must find the Oracle of Athens. The Oracle was the only one who knew the location of the power needed to kill a god. Kratos felt the air in the temple turn pressurized and heavy, a constant reminder that he was a pawn in a game played by the immortals. Kratos moved toward the rooftops to avoid the barricades on the ground. The air at this height was thinner and smelled of the salt from the distant sea and the acrid smoke of the catapult stones. He jumped from one tiled surface to another, the air rushing past his ears as he navigated the path. He encountered a group of minotaurs, their air thick with the scent of the raw hide and the hot and steamy breath of the beasts. They swung massive stone clubs. The sound of the impact against the roof tells a rhythmic and deafening crash. Kratos dodged the strikes, his movements barely stirring the air, before driving his blades into the thick muscle of their throats. The air was filled with the spray of the hot blood, a scent he knew better than his own. He reached a secluded garden where the air was a sudden and strange peace that smelled of the fresh water from a fountain and the sweet nectar of the roses. In the center of the garden, he found a woman who was trying to pull a lever to raise a bridge. The air around her was frantic and smelled of the sharp sweat of fear. She told Kratos that the oracle was trapped in her temple across the chasm, and the air of her words was heavy with the desperation of the city. Kratos helped her, the air ringing with the sound of the heavy iron gears grinding as the bridge moved into place. But as the bridge settled, a wave of harpies swept down and carried the woman into the abyss. The air was filled with her final scream, a sound that Kratos ignored as he focused on the path ahead. The entrance to the Temple of the Oracle was a massive courtyard where the air was hot and carried the scent of the scorched earth. Ares had sent a legion of his best warriors to stop Kratos from reaching the inner sanctum. The air was a chaotic mixture of the clashing bronze and the rhythmic chanting of the sorcerers who summoned the monsters from the dark. Kratos fought with a relentless and cold energy, the air around him turning a pale and shimmering red as the blades of chaos drank the life of his enemies. He felt the heat of the god gaze from across the city, the air in the courtyard feeling pressurized, as if the sky itself were trying to crush him. Kratos delivered a final and devastating blow, and the air suddenly turned into a quiet and ringing silence as the last of the guards fell. He entered the temple and found the oracle hanging from a rope over a deep pit, the air around her thin and carrying the scent of her terror. Harpies circled the ceiling, their shrieks a sharp and rhythmic sound that echoed off the marble walls. Kratos moved with a focused and brutal speed, the air whistling as he used the environment to reach the higher ledges. He cut the rope and caught the woman before she fell into the dark, the air in the room smelling of the old dust and the copper tang of the blood. The oracle looked into his eyes and saw the darkness of his soul, the air between them, a thick and heavy force of shared trauma and hidden truths. The oracle told him that Pandora box was hidden deep within the desert of lost souls, a place where the air was a blinding wall of sand and the screams of the sirens. To reach it, Kratos had to leave the ruins of Athens and cross the sea once more to find the Titan who carried the temple on his back. The air in the sanctum became cold and carried the scent of the mountain mist As the oracle finished her tale, Kratos felt a sense of grim determination. The air in his lungs was steady as he prepared to leave the burning city behind. He knew that the hardest part of his journey was just beginning, and that the air of the world was full of the traps set by the gods. The second part of his journey ended as he stood on the edge of the city, looking out toward the desert in the distance. The air was a chaotic mixture of the smoke from the fires and the salt spray of the sea. Kratos felt the weight of his chains, a constant and grounding force against his skin. He knew that the road ahead would be paved with the bodies of his enemies and the broken promises of Olympus. The moon rose over the water, the air still and expectant as he prepared to enter the desert of the dead. He checked the edge of his blades, the metal clicking in the silence, and stepped into the wind. The air in the desert of lost souls was a blinding and abrasive wall of heat that smelled of dry dust, ancient bone, and the sharp and electric ozone of a coming sandstorm. Kratos stepped onto the shifting dunes, and the atmosphere immediately became a suffocating weight that made every breath feel like he was inhaling the desert itself. The sky was a pale and washed-out yellow. The sun, a distant and flickering ghost behind the clouds of sand. The air was filled with a constant and rhythmic whistling as the wind whipped through the jagged rock formations that rose from the sand like the teeth of a buried beast. Kratos moved with a slow and steady focus, his white skin quickly becoming coated in a layer of fine and gritty dust that blurred the red tattoos on his arms. He had been told that to find the path to the Titan, he must first find and kill the 3 sirens whose songs controlled the air of the desert. The first song reached his ears as a low and rhythmic humming that seemed to vibrate through the very sand beneath his feet. The air around the sound felt thick and heavy, carrying the sweet and deceptive scent of the mountain flowers from a home he no longer had. Kratos followed the vibration, the air whistling as he drew his blades. He found the first siren near a half-buried ruin, her form a pale and ghostly shape in the blowing sand. The air in the clearing was a chaotic mixture of her high-pitched shrieks and the dry roar of the wind. Kratos moved with a brutal and calculated speed, his blades cutting through the air until the siren was silenced, her body dissolving into a cloud of dark and glittering dust. The death of the first siren caused the air in the desert to shift, the wind becoming even more violent and carrying the iron scent of the blood of the ancients. Kratos pushed deeper into the dunes, the air smelling of the scorched earth and the metallic tang of the magic that held the desert together. He encountered a group of sand dwellers, creatures made of the grit and the wind, their air one of a dry and hollow hunger. The battle was a rhythmic and dusty struggle, the sound of the metal chains clashing against the stone-like skin of the monsters. Kratos felt the heat of the desert sun on his back, but the air in his chest remained a cold and steady flame of anger. He delivered a final and devastating strike, the air suddenly turning into a quiet and ringing silence as the creatures were scattered back into the sand. The second siren was hidden within a massive stone structure that looked like a hollowed-out skull. The air inside was stagnant and smelled of the old dust and the dampness of a tomb that had been sealed for centuries. The atmosphere was thick with the rhythmic chanting of the lost souls who had died searching for the temple, their voices a low and mournful vibration in the quiet air. Kratos moved through the dark corridors, the air whistling as his blades hit the stone walls to light his way. He found the siren at the center of a circular chamber, the air there pressurized and heavy with the scent of the desert lilies. The fight was a blur of movement and sound, the air filled with the sparks from the clashing bronze and the screams of the beast. When she fell, the air in the chamber cleared of the oppressive energy, replaced by the cold and stagnant air of the deep earth. Kratos emerged back into the desert as the sun began to set, the air turning a deep and bruised purple. He could hear the final siren calling from the far edge of the wastes, her voice a rhythmic and powerful force that made the dunes shift and flow like water. The air around her was a chaotic storm of sand and lightning, smelling of the ozone and the fresh sea spray. Kratos ran toward the sound, the air in his lungs feeling like a mountain of ice. He reached the final clearing and saw the siren standing before a massive horn made of the bone of a sea monster. The air was thick with the scent of the sulfur and the copper tang of the blood. He fought with a relentless and cold energy, the air ringing with the sound of his blades until the final siren was dead. With all three sirens silenced, Kratos reached the massive horn and blew into it with the strength of a Spartan. The sound was a rhythmic and deafening roar that split the air of the desert and echoed off the distant mountains. The atmosphere suddenly turned still and absolute, the wind dying down to a soft and quiet hiss. From the haze of the sand, a massive shape began to emerge, the air around it vibrating with a low and heavy thud. It was the Titan Kronos, a being so large that the air around him felt like a different world. He wandered the desert with the Temple of Pandora chained to his back, the air smelling of the old stone, the ancient pine trees, and the absolute power of the ones who came before the gods. Kratos moved toward the feet of the Titan, the air becoming thick with the smell of the dry earth and the massive weight of the stone. He began the long climb up the side of the Titan, the air becoming thinner and colder as he rose above the sands of the desert. The surface of the skin felt like a mountain range, the air in the crevices smelling of the damp moss and the cold iron of the chains. Kratos felt a sense of grim anticipation. The air in his lungs was full of the dust of the sirens he had overcome. He was the Ghost of Sparta, and he was entering a place where no mortal was ever meant to walk. The moon rose over the back of the Titan, the air still and expectant as he reached the entrance to the temple. The entrance to the Temple of Pandora was a massive stone door that had been sealed with the blood of 1,000 sacrifices. The air around the door was cold and carried the scent of the absolute darkness within. Kratos saw the chains that held the temple to the Titan, their heir, one of a heavy and ancient burden that smelled of the rusted iron and the mountain mist. He used the strength of his arms to force the heavy stone gears, the sound of the rock grinding a rhythmic and sharp crack in the silence of the heights. The path into the labyrinth was open, and the air that rushed out was stagnant and smelled of the dry papyrus and the old energy of the Isu. Kratos stood at the threshold of the temple, looking back at the desert below him one last time. The air was a chaotic mixture of the sand and the distant smoke of the world of men. He felt the weight of his chains, a constant and grounding force against his skin. He knew that the trials inside would test his mind and his body in ways he could not yet imagine. The stars were bright over the desert, the air still and expectant as he prepared to step into the heart of the labyrinth. He checked the edge of his blades, the metal clicking in the silence, and stepped into the dark. The third part of his journey ended as the massive doors of the temple closed behind him, the air suddenly turning into a quiet and ringing silence. He was alone in the dark, surrounded by the traps and the treasures of the gods. He took a deep breath, the air filling his lungs with the scent of the ancient dust and the promise of a power that could kill a god. The journey through the temple was about to begin, and the air of the world was waiting for the outcome. The air inside the first halls of the Temple of Pandora was a heavy and ancient pressure that smelled of dry stone, cold iron, and the stagnant breath of 1,000 years. Kratos moved past the massive entrance, the atmosphere becoming thicker with the scent of the trials that had claimed the lives of everyone who had come before him. The walls were lined with the bones of those who had failed, their remains turning into a fine and white dust that stirred every time Kratos took a step. The air in this place felt pressurized, as if the mountain itself were trying to crush the life out of his lungs. He reached a central hub where a massive crystalline eye looked down from the ceiling, the air around the artifact vibrating with a low and rhythmic hum that echoed through the hollow chambers. The path led him to the challenge of Atlas, a section of the temple where the air was cold and carried the metallic tang of the heavy chains that held the stone floors in place. To progress, Kratos had to navigate a series of high ledges where the air was thin and whistled through the narrow cracks in the rock. He fought against the undead legionnaires who guarded the bridges, their armor clattering in the silence, the air filling with the iron scent of their dark energy. He moved with a brutal and focused speed, the air around his blades turning hot and smelling of the sulfur. Every strike was a rhythmic and sharp sound that cut through the absolute stillness of the mountain. He reached a massive chamber where a giant stone statue of the Titan Atlas stood, holding a heavy sphere representing the world. The air in the room was stagnant and smelled of the old dust and the copper tang of the blood from the traps. Kratos had to solve a puzzle involving the weight of the stone and the tension of the chains, the air ringing with the sound of the heavy iron gears grinding. He avoided the spinning blades that emerged from the floor, the air whistling as they narrowly missed his skin. He managed to trigger the mechanism that forced the statue to lift the sphere. The air in the room suddenly split by the roar of the grinding stone and the snapping of the ancient wood. As the path forward opened, Kratos encountered a group of Gorgons whose air was a cold and suffocating mist that smelled of the damp moss and the stagnant water. Their hissing was a rhythmic and sharp sound that made the air in the chamber vibrate with a lethal frequency. Kratos had to move with a calculated and quick precision. The air barely stirred as he dodged their petrifying gaze. He grabbed the lead Gorgon and tore her head from her shoulders. The air suddenly filled with a flash of green light that smelled of the ozone and the scorched earth. He used the head to turn the remaining monsters to stone, the air ringing with the sound of the rock shattering as he crushed them with his blades. The hunt for the shield of Atlas took him into the lower pits of the mountain, where the air was hot and carried the scent of the scorched earth and the metallic tang of the blood. He had to cross a series of narrow beams over a pit of fire, the air rising in thick and wavy heat shimmers that smelled of the burning oil. Kratos felt the sweat on his brow, but the air in his heart remained a cold and steady resolve. He fought a giant minotaur in a small and cramped hallway, the air thick with the scent of the raw hide and the hot and steamy breath of the beast. He delivered a final and devastating strike, the air suddenly turning into a quiet and ringing silence as the monster fell into the abyss. He returned to the main chamber with the shield and placed it into the stone door, the air around the mechanism smelling of the old dust and the fresh and cool mountain air that rushed in from the vents. The door opened to reveal a massive elevator that descended into the heart of the Titan, the air becoming thicker and smelling of the deep ocean. This was the transition to the next stage of the temple, and the air in his lungs felt steady as the stone platform began to move. He looked out at the inner workings of the mountain, the air filled with the rhythmic thud of the massive gears that powered the traps of the gods. Kratos reached the bottom of the shaft and found himself in the challenge of Poseidon. The air here was a sudden and strange dampness that smelled of the salt and the deep and cold water of the sea. The atmosphere was a suffocating mist that clung to his skin, carrying the scent of the rotting kelp and the ancient stone. He saw the remains of the divers who had drowned in these halls, their presence a silent and cold warning in the stagnant water. Kratos moved toward a central arena where a caged soldier was being held over a pit of fire. The air in the room was heavy with the smell of the smoke and the desperate and sharp sweat of the man. To appease the gods and open the path, Kratos had to push the cage into the flames. The air was filled with the rhythmic and horrific screaming of the soldier, a sound that Kratos heard with a detached and cold focus. The smell of the burning flesh and the iron scent of the blood filled the chamber, the air turning thick and gray. As the sacrifice was completed, the air in the room suddenly split by a flash of blue light that smelled of the sea spray and the ozone. A pedestal rose from the floor, holding the trident of Poseidon. Kratos took the weapon, and the air around the artifact felt cool and carrying a new and eternal power. With the trident in his hand, Kratos realized he could now breathe beneath the surface of the water. The air in his lungs no longer felt like a fatting warmth, but a steady and quiet flame. He dove into the flooded tunnels of the temple, the air around him a quiet and watery silence that allowed him to hear the distant and rhythmic thud of the Titan footsteps far below. He swam through the dark pipes and the submerged halls, the air in the water smelling of the old stone and the metallic tang of the precursor machines. He was moving deeper into the labyrinth, and the air of the world was becoming a distant and fatting memory. The fourth part of his journey ended as he emerged from the water into a hidden grotto, the air there fresh and smelling of the mountain pine. He stood on a ledge overlooking the vast interior of the temple, the air cold and carrying the salt of the sea. He knew that the trials of the gods were only beginning, and that the air of the labyrinth was full of the ghosts of his past. He checked the edge of his blades, the metal clicking in the silence, and prepared to climb the cliffs of madness. The sun was rising somewhere far above, the air glowing with a pale and shimmering gold as he moved into the next trial. The air on the cliffs of madness was a freezing and abrasive force that smelled of the dry mountain grass, the cold stone, and the sharp and electric ozone of the high altitudes. Kratos emerged from the damp grotto and began the long climb up the exterior of the temple, the atmosphere becoming thinner and carrying the scent of the gray mist that clung to the jagged rocks. The wind was a constant and rhythmic roar that threatened to pull him from the stone walls, but the air in his chest remained steady and full of his cold purpose. He looked down at the vast desert of lost souls far below, where the air was a shimmering and golden haze of heat, and then turned back to the vertical challenge of the mountain. He encountered the harpies of the peaks, their air thick with the scent of wet feathers and the copper smell of their claws. They shrieked with a high and rhythmic frequency that cut through the sound of the wind. Kratos moved across the narrow wooden platforms that were tethered to the stone by massive and rusted chains, the air whistling as he swung from the ropes. He fought the winged beasts on the edges of the abyss, his blades moving in wide and fiery arcs that filled the air with the smell of sulfur and the charred meat. Every time a harpy fell, its body was lost to the swirling gray air of the ravine, leaving only the sound of the flapping wings in the distance. The search for the two necklaces of the Muses led him into the hidden grottos that were carved into the face of the cliff. The air inside these small chambers was still and smelled of the sweet perfume, the old dust, and the soft and white marble of the statues. The atmosphere was a strange and quiet contrast to the violence of the wind outside. Kratos had to solve a series of rhythmic and mechanical puzzles involving the placement of stone blocks and the tension of the ropes. The air rang with the sound of the metal grinding against the rock, a sharp and repetitive noise that echoed in the small spaces. He secured the first necklace, the jewel glowing with a pale and shimmering blue light that smelled of the cooling water. To find the second necklace, Kratos had to navigate a series of elevators that were powered by the weight of the water and the grinding of the iron gears. The air around the machinery was hot and smelled of the oil and the dry grit of the mountain. He fought a group of centaurs on the moving platforms, their hooves making a rhythmic and deafening thud against the wood. Kratos moved with a brutal and focused speed, the air whistling as his blades found the soft flesh of the monsters. He reached the highest peak of the cliffs and claimed the second necklace, the air in his lungs feeling cold and sharp as the wind whipped around him. With the two keys in his possession, he began the descent back toward the heart of the labyrinth. He returned to the central courtyard where the door to the next trial waited. The air there was stagnant and smelled of the old dust and the metallic tang of the blood that had been spilled by the previous explorers. Kratos placed the two necklaces into the stone reliefs of the muses. The air suddenly split by a rhythmic and golden vibration as the mechanism recognized the artifacts. The massive stone doors groaned open, revealing a path that led deep into the subterranean vaults of the mountain. The air that rushed out was hot and carried the scent of the scorched earth and the burning oil. This was the entrance to the challenge of Hades, a place where the air was designed to break the body and the mind of any mortal who dared to enter. Inside the halls of Hades, the air was a suffocating pressure of heat and divine power. The walls were lined with the glowing orange lava that smelled of the sulfur and the molten rock. The atmosphere was thick with the rhythmic swinging of massive scythes that moved across the floor with a lethal and steady frequency. Kratos had to move with a calculated and silent precision. The air barely stirred as he dodged the blades. He saw the ghosts of his past flickering in the heat shimmers of the lava. Their air, one of a silent and agonizing grief. He ignored the visions, the air in his heart having turned to the cold ash of his family long ago. He reached a large arena where the floor was a series of moving stone plates over a pit of fire. The air was a chaotic mixture of the smoke and the iron scent of the blood from the monsters that rose from the ground. Kratos fought against the satyrs, their air thick with the scent of the goat hide and the sharp sweat of the battle. They moved with a rhythmic and unnatural speed, their double-bladed staves whistling through the air. Kratos met their strikes with a roar, the air ringing with the sound of the bronze clashing against the steel. He used the power of the gods to summon a storm of ice, the air in the room suddenly turning cold and smelling of the frozen sea as the monsters were shattered into pieces. The final stage of the trial led him to a massive mechanical minotaur that guarded the passage to the inner sanctum. The beast was made of the iron and the bone, its air thick with the scent of the hot metal and the steam from its nostrils. The air in the arena was a blur of dust and movement as the creature charged, the sound of its hooves a rhythmic and deafening roar that shook the very walls of the temple. Kratos had to use the massive logs that were suspended from the ceiling to strike the monster, the air ringing with the sound of the impact. He delivered a final and devastating strike, pinning the beast to the wall as the air was filled with the smell of the ozone and the burning wood. The death of the Minotaur caused the air in the chamber to clear of the oppressive heat, replaced by the cold and stagnant air of the deeper vaults. Kratos stood over the remains, his breath a steady and heavy rhythm in the quiet. He had overcome the challenges of the earth and the fire, and the air of the labyrinth was beginning to feel like a graveyard for the guardians of the gods. He found a hidden passage that led toward the summit of the mountain, the air there becoming crisp and carrying the scent of the night sky. He was closer to Pandora Box than any man had ever been, and the air in his chest felt like a mountain of ice and fire. The fifth part of his journey ended as he stepped onto a balcony overlooking the Titan Kronos, who was still wandering the desert far below. The air was cold and carried the salt of the sea and the scent of the dry shrubs. Kratos looked out at the world of men, a place that felt like a distant and fatting dream. He checked the chains on his arms, the metal clicking in the silence of the night, and prepared for the final ascent to the chamber of the box. The stars were bright over the desert, the air still and expectant as he moved toward the end of his trials. The air at the summit of the Temple of Pandora was a thin and freezing stillness that smelled of the high clouds, the ancient stone, and the sharp and electric ozone of the gods. Kratos emerged from the dark interior of the mountain onto a wide and circular platform that sat above the head of the Titan Kronos. The wind here was a constant and rhythmic sigh that carried the scent of the distant salt from the Aegean Sea. In the center of the courtyard sat a massive stone structure, the air around it vibrating with a low and blue energy that made the shadows on the floor dance and flicker. This was the final chamber, the place where the ultimate weapon had been hidden since the dawn of the world. To reach the box, Kratos had to navigate one last series of mechanical traps that guarded the inner sanctum. The air was thick with the scent of the old oil and the metallic tang of the massive bronze gears that hummed beneath the floor. He moved through a hallway where the walls were lined with the faces of the gods, their stone eyes following his every movement. The air in the passage was stagnant and smelled of the dry papyrus and the old dust of the centuries. He had to align the symbols of the gods in a rhythmic and precise order, the air ringing with the sound of the stone grinding against stone. Every time a lock clicked into place, the air in the room seemed to lighten, the heavy pressure of the temple's defenses finally beginning to fade. He entered the central vault, where the air was suddenly split by a blinding and golden light that smelled of the sun and the absolute power of the ancients. In the middle of the room sat Pandora box, a massive chest of stone and gold that hummed with a frequency that Kratos could feel in the marrow of his bones. The air around the box was so pressurized that it felt like a physical wall, carrying the scent of the mountain mist and the fresh sea spray. Kratos stood before the artifact, his breath a steady and heavy rhythm in the quiet. He reached out and touched the cold metal of the lid, the air in his chest feeling like a cold and steady flame. He had spent 10 years serving the gods for this moment, and the heir of the world was waiting for his choice. He gripped the handles and began to drag the box out of the temple and toward the edge of the cliff. The air was a blur of movement and sound as the heavy stones scraped against the floor, a rhythmic and grating noise that echoed through the mountain. He reached the balcony where the sun was beginning to set, the air turning a deep and bruised purple over the desert of lost souls. He felt a sense of grim triumph. The air in his lungs was full of the hope of his victory. He believed that with this power, he could finally kill Ares and find the peace that the gods had promised him. The air was still and expectant as he prepared to open the lid and take the strength of the ancients into his own hands. But the gods were not finished with their games, and the air of Olympus was never filled with mercy. Far away in the burning ruins of Athens, Ares felt the shift in the energy of the world. The god of war stood amongst the broken marble of his sister's city, the air around him a toxic haze of fire and the iron scent of the dying. He plucked a jagged pillar of stone from a shattered temple, the air screaming as he hurled it across the desert with the force of a falling star. Kratos heard the sound before he saw the shadow, the air suddenly turning hot and pressurized. The stone pillar pierced the sky, traveling miles in a heartbeat, and struck Kratos through the chest. The air in Kratos's lungs was crushed out in a single and sickening gasp as he was pinned to the temple wall. The scent of his own blood and the metallic tang of the stone filled the cold mountain air. He looked down at the box, which was now being carried away by the harpies of Ares, the air filled with their rhythmic and mocking shrieks. Kratos felt the life fatting from his body, the air turning into a freezing and lightless void. He had come so close to his revenge, only to be struck down by the very god he sought to destroy. His eyes closed, and the air of the world of the living was replaced by the cold and stagnant silence of the grave. He tumbled through the abyss of death, the air whistling past him with the voices of the thousands he had sent to the underworld. He landed in the pits of Tartarus, where the air was a thick and gray fog that smelled of sulfur, old bone, and the copper tang of the river of blood. This was the realm of Hades, a place where the air was heavy with the rhythmic moaning of the lost souls and the distant and hollow clanking of the chains. Kratos refused to accept the silence of the tomb, the air in his spirit chest burning with a fury that even death could not quench. He saw a rope made of the hair of the Fates dangling from the ceiling, the air around it smelling of the ozone and the ancient magic. He began his climb out of the pits, the air around him hot and carrying the scent of the scorched earth. He grabbed onto the jagged rocks and the skeletal remains of the Titans, his movements barely stirring the heavy and airless atmosphere of the depths. He fought against the shades of his fallen enemies, their touch cold and smelling of the dry dust. The air in the underworld was a constant struggle, a rhythmic and agonizing ascent through the layers of the dead. He saw a small opening of light far above, the air around it smelling of the fresh earth and the mountain pine. He pulled himself through the crack and emerged into the world of the living once more. He found himself in the freshly dug grave in the heart of Athens, the air around him smelling of the damp soil and the cold night air. The mysterious gravedigger was there, his air one of a quiet and knowing respect. The man helped Kratos out of the hole, the air in the city still thick with the smoke and the iron scent of the war. Kratos stood in the graveyard, his breath a steady and heavy rhythm in the quiet. He looked toward the Acropolis, where Ares was holding Pandora box and mocking the heavens. The air in his lungs felt like a mountain of ice, and the air of the city was a call to the final battle. The sixth part of his journey ended as he stepped out of the cemetery and into the ruins of Athens. The air was a chaotic mixture of the fire and the salt spray of the sea. Kratos felt the weight of his chains, a constant and grounding force against his skin. He had returned from the dead, and the gods were about to learn the cost of their betrayal. The moon was bright over the city, the air still and expectant as he prepared to take back the box and end the reign of the god of war. The air in the center of Athens was a suffocating pressure of heat and divine power, smelling of the ozone from the gods and the bitter scent of the ash that coated the ruins. Kratos moved through the shattered streets toward the temple where Ares stood, the atmosphere turning electric as he approached the giant form of his enemy. The god of war was holding Pandora box over his head, his laughter a rhythmic and deafening vibration that made the marble of the Acropolis crack and fall. The air around Ares was a chaotic storm of red and gold energy, carrying the iron scent of the blood and the sharp smell of the sulfur. Kratos stood in the shadow of the god, his breath a steady and heavy rhythm, as he prepared to reclaim the weapon that had been stolen from him in the desert. He moved with a silent and lethal focus, the air whistling as he used the chains of his blades to swing across the broken bridges and the crumbling walls. He reached the platform where the box had been placed, the air there vibrating with a low and blue frequency that made his skin prickle. Ares did not see him at first. His attention turned toward the heavens as he mocked the other gods of Olympus. Kratos grabbed the lid of the box, the air in his chest feeling like a cold and steady flame. He pulled with the strength of a man who had returned from the pits of Hades, and the air was suddenly split by a blinding flash of white light that smelled of the sun and the absolute power of the ancients. As the box opened, the air in the city was sucked into the artifact, creating a sudden and ringing silence that felt like a vacuum. Then, a wave of golden energy exploded outward, the air smelling of the fresh sea spray and the ozone of 1,000 storms. Kratos felt his body begin to grow, the air around him expanding and turning hot as he absorbed the power of the box. He rose higher and higher, the buildings of Athens becoming like toys beneath his feet. The atmosphere turned thick and pressurized as he reached the size of a god. The air at this height thin and cold, but filled with a new and eternal strength. He stood eye-to-eye with Ares, and the air between them became a physical wall of hatred and shared history. Ares looked at Kratos with a mixture of surprise and a dark, rhythmic amusement. The god of war drew his massive four-armed blades, the air whistling as the weapons cut through the smoke and the clouds. Kratos met the first strike with the blades of chaos, and the air rang with a sound that felt like the world was breaking apart. The impact sent a shockwave through the city, the air smelling of the scorched stone and the metallic tang of the divine steel. The battle was a chaotic roar of clashing bronze and the rhythmic thud of the giants stepping through the ruins of the temples. Kratos moved with the focus of a man who had nothing left to lose, the air around him a blur of fire and white-hot energy. The fight moved from the streets of the city into the shallow waters of the Aegean Sea, the air there fresh and smelling of the salt and the cold mist. Every step caused a rhythmic and massive splashing of the waves that rose up like walls of glass. Ares used his power to summon a storm of fire, the air turning into a suffocating heat that smelled of the burning pitch and the dry earth. Kratos countered with the strength he had taken from the box, his movements barely stirred by the density of the air. He drove his blades into the shoulder of the god, and the air was filled with a spray of golden ichor that smelled of the honey and the ozone. Ares realized that the physical struggle was only part of the war, and he reached out to tear the fabric of Kratos' mind. The air in the arena suddenly shifted, turning from the salt spray of the sea into a cold and thin mist that smelled of the pine needles and the mountain air of the north. Kratos found himself standing in a strange and shifting version of his own home, the air inside smelling of the wood smoke and the sweet, dry scent of the straw. He saw the illusions of his wife and daughter, their air one of a quiet and peaceful domesticity. But the shadows of his past began to emerge from the corners of the room, their air smelling of the sulfur and the charred meat of the massacre. The trial was a nightmare of sound and memory that took place in a world where the air felt like a heavy and suffocating blanket. Kratos had to fight hundreds of versions of himself to protect the family he had already lost, the air in the small room becoming hot and stagnant with the effort. Every time a shadow struck, the air was filled with a high and rhythmic screaming that made his heart freeze. He moved with a desperate and frantic energy, the air whistling as he spun his blades in a continuous circle of bronze and fire. He felt the weight of his sins in the very air he breathed, a constant reminder that he was the monster of his own story. The seventh part of his journey ended as the illusion began to fade, the air in the room turning back into the cold and gray mist of the sea. Kratos stood alone in the water, his breath a steady and heavy rhythm in the quiet of the night. He had survived the god's mental trap, but the air in his mind was still full of the screams of his past. He looked at Ares, who was waiting for him with a cruel and rhythmic smile. The final confrontation was only moments away, and the air of Greece was still and expectant as the two giants prepared for the end. Kratos checked the chains on his arms, the metal clicking in the silence, and moved forward through the waves. The air over the Aegean Sea was a cold and heavy pressure that smelled of the salt spray, the ozone of the gods, and the metallic tang of the blood that spilled from the wounds of the giants. Kratos stood in the shallow water, the waves crashing against his legs with a rhythmic and massive force that echoed through the ruins of the nearby city. Ares reached into the very fabric of the air and tore the blades of chaos from Kratos' arms, the sound of the chains snapping a sharp and horrific crack that filled the silence of the bay. The smell of the burnt flesh and the iron scent of the blood returned to the air, leaving Kratos empty-handed and vulnerable. The god of war stood over him, his air one of a cruel and rhythmic triumph that made the water around them boil with heat. In the center of the bay, Kratos saw the blade of the gods, a massive sword of stone and bronze that had been used as a decorative bridge in the city. The air around the weapon was still and carried the scent of the ancient marble and the blessing of Athena. Kratos moved with a desperate and focused speed, the air rushing past him as he dove toward the hilt. He gripped the cold metal, and the air was suddenly split by a rhythmic and golden vibration as the sword recognized its new master. He lifted the blade from the water, the air in his lungs feeling like a mountain of ice. The weight of the sword was a grounding force against the chaos of the divine energy, and the air in the bay turned a pale and shimmering gold as the final duel began. The confrontation was a struggle of pure and raw determination. The air was sliced by the massive blade, the sound of the impact against Ares' armor a rhythmic and deafening roar that echoed across the islands. Kratos moved with the focus of a man who had already been through the pits of death, the air whistling with every strike. He managed to drive the blade through the chest of the god of war, and the air suddenly turned into a sudden and ringing silence as the life of the immortal began to fade. Ares looked at him with eyes that were finally clear of the madness, his voice a low and raspy vibration in the cold air as he realized his own creation had become his end. The death of Ares was an explosion of energy that reshaped the very air of Greece. A wave of white light moved out from the center of the bay, the air smelling of the ozone and the fresh sea spray as the power of the god returned to the earth. The fires in Athens were extinguished, the air turning clear and cool for the first time in weeks. Kratos stood alone in the water as he returned to his mortal size, his breath a steady and heavy rhythm in the quiet. He had achieved his revenge, and the heir of the world was finally free of the shadow of the god of war. But as the silence settled, he realized that the air in his own mind was still full of the screams of the family he had lost. He traveled to the high cliffs of the Aegean, the air there thin and cold as he looked out at the horizon. He called out to the gods of Olympus, his voice a rhythmic and desperate plea in the stillness of the mountain. He reminded them of their promise to take away the visions of his past, the air around him carrying the scent of the dry shrubs and the ancient stone. But the voice of Athena came to him through the wind, her tone a cool and detached vibration. She told him that the gods had forgiven his sins, but no power on earth or heaven could take away the memories of what he had done. The air in his chest felt like a suffocating blanket. He had won the war, but he had lost the peace he had sought for 10 long years. Kratos looked down at the black water far below, the air whistling past the jagged rocks. He felt a sense of absolute and quiet despair, the air in his heart having turned to the cold ash of his past once more. He believed that the only way to find silence was to embrace the darkness of the sea. He cast himself from the mountain, the air rushing past his ears in a final and desperate attempt to escape the ghosts that stayed with him every time he closed his eyes. The scent of the salt and the cold mist filled his lungs as he fell, the air of his life finally coming to an end. But the gods were not finished with him, and the air of the world was still thick with his purpose. As he touched the surface of the water, a golden light reached down from the clouds and pulled him back into the air. He was carried to the peak of Mount Olympus, where the air was a sweet and heavy perfume of the nectar and the clouds. He stood before the empty throne of the god of war, the air around the stone warm and carrying the scent of the coming storms. Athena stood there, her air one of a quiet and steady respect. She told him that the throne was now his to claim, and that the air of the world would always have a place for a god of war. The 8th part of his journey ended as he walked toward the throne, the air in the chamber filled with the low and rhythmic chanting of the other gods. He took his seat, the cold metal of the armrests feeling like a familiar and heavy burden. He looked down at the lands of Greece, the air glowing with a pale and shimmering gold as the sun rose over the mountains. He was the ghost of Sparta, the man who had killed a god and taken his place, but the air in his lungs remained cold. He checked the edge of his new blade, the metal clicking in the silence of the heavens, and prepared for the long watch that was about to begin. The final realization of his godhood was a weight that he accepted with a grim and steady focus. The air on the peak was still and expectant, a heartbeat that was now his own to command across the centuries. He saw the wars of men beginning in the valleys below, the air there thick with the smoke and the iron scent of the blood. He was the new god of war, and the story of his reign was just beginning. The air on the peak of Mount Olympus was a thin and eternal stillness that smelled of the high clouds, the sweet nectar of the halls, and the sharp and electric ozone of the divine. Kratos sat upon his new throne, the stone cold and massive beneath him, a stark contrast to the burning heat of the city he had left behind. The atmosphere in the throne room was thick with the rhythmic and low chanting of the lesser deities, their air one of a cautious and distant respect. He was the first mortal to ever take a seat among the 12, but the air in his chest remained a heavy and familiar weight. He looked down through the floor of clouds at the world of men, where the air was a patchwork of the morning mist and the lingering smoke of the Great War. He saw the city of Athens beginning to rebuild, the air there smelling of the fresh cedar and the wet plaster of the new temples. The people moved like ants in the distance, their air one of a quiet and weary hope as they cleared the ruins of Ares' madness. Kratos felt no joy in their recovery. The air in his mind was a constant and rhythmic replay of the faces of his wife and daughter. He realized that the throne was not a reward, but a different kind of prison, where the air was silent enough for the screams of his past to echo forever. He gripped the hilt of the blade of the gods, the metal clicking against the stone of the throne, and the air around the weapon hummed with a low and blue frequency. As the months passed in the world of men, Kratos began to exert his will over the air of the battlefields. He watched as the armies of Sparta marched across the Peloponnese, their air thick with the scent of the old bronze and the sharp sweat of the march. He felt a rhythmic and deep connection to his former brothers, the air in his lungs turning hot every time a spear was leveled or a shield was raised. He began to intervene in the wars, his presence a sudden and violent shift in the atmosphere of the camps. The air around the Spartan tents would turn cold and smell of the ozone just before a victory, a sign that their new god was watching over them from the heights. The other gods watched him with an air of growing concern, their voices a low and rhythmic vibration in the halls of the palace. They saw that the Ghost of Sparta did not rule with the detached and cruel grace of the old gods, but with a raw and relentless fury. The air on Olympus became pressurized and heavy with the tension of his presence. Kratos ignored their whispers, the air in his heart having turned to the cold ash of the mountains long ago. He was a god of the sword and the blood, and the air of the world was a map of the conflicts he intended to lead. He checked the edge of his blade, the sound of the sharpening stone, a rhythmic and steady hiss in the quiet of the peak. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the air turned a deep and bruised purple, Kratos stood at the edge of the overlook. He saw the mysterious gravedigger standing in the ruins of a distant valley, the air around the old man smelling of the damp soil and the absolute stillness of a tomb. The man looked up toward the mountain, his air one of a quiet and knowing patience. Kratos realized then that his journey was part of a cycle that even the gods could not fully control. The air of the future was a vast and unwritten territory, thick with the scent of the coming storms, and the iron scent of the blood that would eventually be spilled on the doorsteps of Olympus itself. He returned to his throne as the stars began to appear, the air in the chamber cold, and carrying the salt of the sea and the scent of the dry shrubs. He took a deep breath, the air filling his lungs with the power of his godhood and the steady purpose of his reign. He was no longer the servant of Ares or the pawn of Athena. He was the god of war, and the air of the world was his to command. The sound of the wind through the pillars of the palace was a rhythmic and eternal heartbeat, a reminder that his watch would last as long as there were men to fight and stories to tell. The ninth part of his journey ended with Kratos closing his eyes, the air in the throne room falling into a sudden and absolute silence. The images of his family were still there, but they were now surrounded by the golden light of his divinity. He accepted the burden of the long watch, the air in his chest feeling like a mountain of ice and fire. He was the Ghost of Sparta, the man who had conquered death and the gods, and his story was now the heartbeat of Greece. The morning brought a sharp and cold sun that glittered on the marble of the throne, and the new god moved into the light of his eternal reign. The cycle of the first war was complete, and the air of the world was still. The gods sat in their halls, the men lived in their cities, and the Ghost of Sparta sat on his throne, waiting for the next time the air would turn hot with the scent of the fire. He was the master of his own destiny, and the silence of the heights was his only true companion.